In the autumn of 2003, every grain farmer in Lac-Saint-Jean County, Quebec, seeded the same way. They broke the ground in October, turned it over to a depth of 8 inches, and left it bare through the winter months while the frost worked the soil the way their fathers had taught them the frost should work it. This was not a decision in any meaningful sense of the word. It was reflex. It was the accumulated weight of 3 generations of men who had watched the same fields freeze and thaw and green up again every spring, and who had concluded, reasonably and without much ceremony, that the way things were done was the way things worked. Nobody in Lac-Saint-Jean in 2003 was losing sleep over their tillage practices. The soil came back every spring. The canola came in. The barley came in. The numbers in the ledger were acceptable, and acceptable was what most farmers in the county had learned to aim for. Let me tell you what acceptable looked like in those years, because you need to understand the world that Frank Arsenault was walking into before you can understand what he did to change it. A typical grain operation in Lac-Saint-Jean County ran somewhere between 400 and 900 acres of canola, barley, and spring wheat in rotation, with maybe a quarter of that acreage in hay for the few operations that still kept beef cattle on the side. The equipment was heavy. The tractors had been getting heavier every decade since the 70s, and the tillage implements that followed them had gotten wider and deeper to match, because wider and deeper meant faster, and faster meant you could work more ground before the weather closed in. The soil in those fields was a mix of gray luvisols in the higher ground and dark clay in the lower-lying areas near the river, and it was not spectacular soil by the standards of the Black Belt farms in southern Ontario. But it was persistent. It had been producing grain since the homestead era when the first settlers pushed north from the St. Lawrence Valley with their horses and their stubbornness, and it came back every year without much encouragement, which was exactly the kind of soil that Lac-Saint-Jean farmers had come to rely on and in their quieter moments to love. The Arsenault operation sat on 720 acres in the eastern part of the county, about 11 kilometers from the town of Alma. Frank's father, Gerard Arsenault, had farmed it since 1974, taking over from his own father, who had broken the original quarter sections back in the late 1940s. Gerard was a deliberate man, organized in the way that men become organized when their margin for error is narrow and the weather doesn't apologize. He kept a yellow notebook on the kitchen counter, which is where Frank first learned to read numbers, watching his father go through the input costs and the yield records every November with the same careful patience he applied to everything else. The operation averaged 32 bushels of canola per acre and about 58 bushels of barley, which was consistent with the county average and which Gerard considered adequate, not exceptional. Adequate. Let me tell you about Frank Arsenault, because he is the reason this story exists, and he is different from most of the people you hear about in stories like this one. Frank was 51 years old in the spring of 2004. He had not gone to university. He had worked the home farm since he was 16, taking over full management from Gerard in 1998, when his father's back gave out for the last time, and the doctor told him he was done driving equipment. Frank had been paying attention to the land since before he was old enough to drive it. He had noticed things. He had written things down. He kept his own notebook, a red one, that he had started filling sometime around 2001, covered in his careful block printing, full of numbers and questions and references to articles he had ordered by mail from an agricultural publisher in Saskatchewan. What Frank had been reading about and thinking about was called no-till seeding. More specifically, it was a system that a growing number of farmers on the Great Plains had been developing since the late 1980s, in which you seeded directly into the previous year's crop residue without any prior tillage whatsoever. No dissing, no chisel plowing, no mold board work in the fall. You left the stubble standing through the winter, and in the spring you ran a direct seeder through it and let the seed find its way into undisturbed soil. The conventional view in Lac-Saint-Jean in 2003 was that this was an idea that might work on the flat, dry prairies of Alberta and Saskatchewan, where the light, silty soils responded well to minimum disturbance and where the summers were dry enough that surface residue helped conserve moisture. But Quebec was different. Quebec had heavier soils and higher moisture, and a shorter frost-free period, and a tradition of intensive fall tillage that went back farther than anyone could remember. The frost had to get into the ground to break up the clay. The residue had to be incorporated to prevent disease. This was not a philosophy, it was understood. Frank's red notebook had different numbers. A study out of Laval University he had read in 2002 showed that no-till systems on clay-loam soils in Quebec's agricultural zone could reduce input costs by between $40 and $65 per acre when you factored out the fuel and equipment hours that tillage required. Research from Agriculture Canada's Lennoxville station documented significant reductions in soil erosion and improvements in soil organic matter under no-till management over a 5-year period on soils comparable to the gray luvisols on the Arsenault farm. A farmer in Manitoba named Ted Roxton, whose operation Frank had read about in a Prairie Farmer article, had documented fuel savings of over $28,000 annually after converting his 100-acre grain farm to full no-till over 3 years, along with a measurable improvement in his wheat yields once the soil biology had had time to recover. Frank had done the math for the Arsenault farm. If he could eliminate fall tillage on even half the operation, he was looking at fuel savings of somewhere between $18,000 and $22,000 per year, reduced equipment wear that would extend the life of his aging tractor fleet by an estimated 3 to 4 seasons, and, if the soil biology research held on Arsenault ground, a long-term improvement in organic matter that would show up in his yield numbers within 5 years. The upfront cost was a direct seeder capable of handling heavy residue. He had priced it out. A good used Bourgault would run him somewhere around $85,000. The fuel and input savings at the rate he had calculated would recover that investment in 4 growing seasons. He brought this to the kitchen table on a Thursday evening in March of 2004. Gerard Arsenault sat across from him and listened for 20 minutes without speaking. He looked at the red notebook. He looked at the printouts from the Laval study that Frank had arranged on the table in the order he wanted to discuss them. He looked at the numbers Frank had written in columns on a piece of graph paper, the way Frank had watched him do with his own columns for 30 years. He set his coffee cup down about halfway through and did not pick it up again. Frank finished, the kitchen was quiet. Gerard looked at his son for a long moment. Then he looked at the numbers again. Then he said, slowly, "This is not how we do it. Here." Frank said he knew that. Gerard said, "The clay needs to be worked. You leave that residue on the surface, you're going to have disease pressure and compaction and a yield penalty before July." Frank said the research didn't support that conclusion on comparable soils, and he had the citations if his father wanted to look at them. Gerard did not look at them. He looked at the graph paper for a while longer. Then he said, "I need to think about it." He thought about it for 3 weeks. What he said at the end of those 3 weeks was this: "You can try it on the East Quarter, 1 season. We'll see what the numbers say." He paused. "Don't touch the home field until we know something." Frank said that was fine. "Now, let me tell you about the man who made certain that everyone in a 20-kilometer radius knew about Gerard Arsenault's son and his plan to stop tilling the ground. because no story like this one is complete without someone who mistakes unfamiliarity for error. His name was Régent Pelletier. He was 63 years old in 2004 and had been the manager of the Alma Agricultural Co-op since 1985, having worked his way up from the loading dock over a decade and a half of early mornings and the kind of institutional loyalty that gets rewarded in small-town Quebec with a key to the front door and a nameplate on a desk. Régent was not a dishonest man. He was not an unkind man. He was a man who had spent 20 years dispensing advice along with fertilizer and chemical inputs to every grain farmer in the county, and who had accumulated, through those 20 years of daily contact with the land and the people who worked it, an absolute certainty that he understood how farming in Lac-Saint-Jean worked. He held court at the co-op counter most mornings from 7:30 to 9, and his opinions on farming practice carried the weight that comes from longevity and from being the man who controlled the account that most of his neighbors needed before seeding. Frank made the mistake, if it was a mistake, of stopping at the co-op in early April of 2004 to price out the starter fertilizer he needed for his no-till trial on the East Quarter. He was not announcing anything. He was buying inputs. But Régent Pelletier asked him what kind of seeder he was using, and Frank told him. The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds. "You're not tilling the East Quarter at all?" Régent said. Frank said that was correct. Régent looked at the man standing next to him at the counter, a farmer named Gaston Bourassa, who ran 600 acres of canola south of town. And then Régent Pelletier said, in a voice that managed to be both friendly and definitive at the same time, "Frank, your father tilled that ground for 30 years and it never gave him a problem. You leave that residue on the surface and you're going to have sclerotinia pressure by July, and your emergence is going to be spotty in the low spots where the trash collects. I've seen guys try this from out west and bring it in here and it doesn't translate." He shook his head slowly. "Quebec's clay is not Alberta silt. The soil needs to be worked." Frank looked at Régent Pelletier for a moment. He was not angry. Or if he was, it didn't show in anything you could see. The Agriculture Canada data from Lennoxville shows disease incidence comparable to conventional systems after the second year, he said. And the emergence issue is a seeder calibration question, not a tillage question. I've got the Bourgeot set to cut through 6 inches of residue. He paused. "I've got the papers in the truck if you want to look at them." Régent smiled the smile of a man who has just heard something he considers beside the point. "I've been advising farmers in this county for 20 years, he said. "I think I know a little something about how this ground behaves." Frank bought his starter, fertilizer, and drove home. Let me pause here, because I think what just happened at that co-op counter is worth sitting with for a moment before we go any further. Régent Pelletier had 20 years of experience. He was not wrong that he knew the Lac-Saint-Jean farms and the men who ran them. He was not wrong that he had seen outside ideas come into the county and fail to take root. What he was wrong about was the source of his certainty. His 20 years of experience were 20 years of watching the same system operate under the same assumptions on the same heavy clay soils. He had never seen a well-managed no-till system through a full 5-year cycle on comparable Quebec ground, because no one in Lac-Saint-Jean had ever run one long enough to show him. His conviction was not built on evidence of failure. It was built on the absence of evidence of success, and those are not the same thing. Frank Arsenault understood that. Régent Pelletier did not. Let me tell you about the spring and summer of 2004, because that first season on the East Quarter is where the story begins to turn. Frank seeded the East Quarter in the last week of April, running his direct seeder through standing canola stubble from the previous year's crop. The stubble was about 14 inches tall and denser than what most of the direct seeders he had researched were designed for, and he spent 2 days adjusting the coulter depth and the press wheel pressure before he got the seeding depth consistent enough to satisfy him. He seeded 160 acres of spring wheat directly into the residue, at a seeding rate slightly higher than his normal practice to compensate for the lower emergence he expected in his first year with the system. He did not till. He did not disc. He did not run a harrow over the surface to even things out. He seeded and he waited. The emergence was uneven in the low spots for the first 2 weeks, the way Réjean had predicted it would be. Frank noted this in the red notebook with a date and a description and a possible cause, and waited to see whether it resolved. It did by the middle of May as the soil warmed and the residue in the low spots broke down enough to allow the late-emerging seedlings to catch up with the rest of the stand. By the end of May, the east quarter had a stand that was, by Frank's visual assessment, not significantly different from the home field which he had tilled in the conventional way. He noted this in the red notebook. The disease pressure through June and July was, as the Lennoxville data had suggested it would be, comparable to his conventional acres. He scouted for sclerotinia on the same schedule he used on his tilled fields and found infection rates in the east quarter that were within the normal range for the county. He applied a fungicide pass at early flowering as he always did, and the east quarter responded the way his other fields responded. What was different was the soil. Frank carried a soil probe with him in the truck from May onward that season, the way some men carry a jackknife. He probed the east quarter every 2 weeks through the growing season, recording the depth at which he hit significant resistance, and he probed the home field on the same schedule for comparison. By the end of July, the east quarter probe was going down 11 inches before meeting resistance. In the home field, which had been tilled to 8 inches the previous fall, the probe was hitting a compaction layer at 9 inches that Frank recognized as the classic tillage pan that forms just below the working depth of the plow. A hard pan that had been building there, he now understood, for 30 years, invisible from the surface. Never questioned, never measured, just accepted as the way the soil was. He probed it in the home field 3 times on different days to be sure. 9 inches, every time. In August, Frank cut a soil sample from both fields and sent them to the lab at Laval. The east quarter came back at 3.4% organic matter. The home field came back at 2.9%. 1 season, 160 acres. A measurable difference in the organic matter of soil that had been farmed the same way for 55 years until 12 months ago. He did not tell his father about the soil probe numbers yet. He wanted the yield data first. The combine went through the east quarter in the second week of September. Frank weighed the loads at the elevator, kept his tickets, and ran the numbers that evening at the kitchen table. The east quarter had yielded 61.4 bushels of spring wheat per acre. The home field under conventional management had yielded 57.8 bushels. The east quarter had outperformed the conventional system by 6.2% in the first season. He had spent $85,000 on the direct seeder. He had saved $12,400 in fuel and tillage hours by not working the east quarter. At current spring wheat prices, the additional yield from the no-till acres represented roughly $3,200 in additional revenue. The total first-year financial advantage of the no-till system, savings plus additional yield, was $15,600. He put all of this on graph paper, the way his father had always put things on graph paper, and he brought it to the kitchen table on a Sunday evening in October. Gerard Arsenault looked at the numbers for a long time. He looked at the yield tickets from the elevator. He looked at the soil probe data Frank had written in 2 columns, one for the east quarter and one for the home field, with the dates and the depths carefully recorded. He picked up the graph paper and held it closer to the kitchen light. He was quiet for what felt like a long time. Then he said, "You were right about the tillage pan." He said it the way a man says something he has been working his way toward for a while, not an apology, an acknowledgement. Frank said the pan was there before he started. He had just been the first one to measure it. Gerard nodded slowly. He picked up the soil organic matter report from Laval and read it again. Then he said, "What does the East Quarter look like next year if you run the same system?" They sat at that table until 11 o'clock. When Frank finally went to bed, he heard his father in the kitchen for another half hour. And in the morning, the red notebook had been moved from the counter to the table. And there were 2 pages of his father's handwriting at the back that had not been there the night before. Gerard gave him the west half of the home field in the spring of 2005. Let me tell you about the years that followed, because the East Quarter was the proof of concept. The home field is where the story became something larger. Frank converted the home field to no-till in sections over 2 seasons, which was slower than he would have liked but faster than his father would have preferred. And the tension between those 2 timelines was a productive one, in the way that tensions between careful men sometimes are. By the end of 2006, 400 acres of the Arsenault operation were under full no-till management. By 2007, the number was 580 acres. Gerard had stopped arguing. He had started asking questions instead, which was his version of endorsement. The numbers in those years were unambiguous in the direction they were pointing. The no-till acres were producing consistently at or above the yield of the conventionally tilled acres, while costing significantly less to farm. The fuel savings alone by 2007 were running $24,000 annually. Equipment hours were down 35% on the no-till acres, and the soil, season by season, was visibly changing in ways that Frank could measure with his probe and his lab results. The organic matter in the oldest no-till paddocks, the East Quarter fields that had now been in the system for 4 years, had climbed from 3.4% to 4.1%. The tillage pan that had been sitting at 9 inches in the home field was, by 2007, beginning to break down under the action of earthworms and root channels that had nowhere to go but deeper in the undisturbed soil. The probe was going down 13 inches in those fields by the fall of 2007. Frank kept records of all of this in the red notebook. He had started a second one by 2006. The farmers who drove past on the county road understood what they were seeing on the Arsenault farm, the way people often understand things they haven't been introduced to, which is to say, imperfectly. They saw fields full of standing stubble in October, when every other farm in the county was turned over and black. They saw seeding happening in late April into what looked like last year's trash. It looked wrong to them in the specific way that unfamiliar things look wrong before you understand them. And some of what they saw and some of what they concluded made its way back to the co-op counter, where Réjean Pelletier was still holding court at 7:30 most mornings, and was still expressing, with somewhat less certainty than he had managed in 2004, his reservations about the wisdom of leaving clay ground unworked through a Quebec winter. He had a theory about why Frank's numbers might be misleading, something about the East Quarter having historically lighter soil than the home field, or about the spring wheat variety Frank was using being a higher-yielding variety than the county standard, or about the comparison not being fair because you couldn't evaluate a system in 3 years that needed 10 years to show its full results. This theory circulated. It had the persistence that theories have when the people who hold them are not quite ready to let go of them, because letting go meant considering the possibility that a grain farmer with a red notebook and a stubborn streak had seen something that 20 years of accumulated co-op wisdom had missed. The wet spring came in 2008. Let me tell you about the spring of 2008, because That season is the reason this story is still being told. And because it is the moment conversation that had been running quietly through the county for 4 years finally got an answer that left no room for interpretation. The spring of 2008 was the wettest in Lac-Saint-Jean County since 1976. Rainfall from late April through June ran approximately 60% above the 30-year average. The St. Jean River came up to its banks in May and stayed there through most of June. The lower-lying fields across the county were saturated, and the fields that had been fall-tilled turned over to a depth of 8 inches and left bare through the winter with no surface cover were in the worst shape of all. Water pooled on the tilled surfaces because there was nothing to slow it down and nowhere to go. The bare, worked soil crusted under the rain, reducing infiltration and increasing runoff, and the tillage pans sitting at 9 and 10 inches below the surface, invisible and unmeasured on most farms in the county, were acting as impermeable layers that prevented the water from draining downward. Gaston Bourassa could not get into his fields until June 12th. That is a seeding date that in Lac-Saint-Jean County is not a seeding date, that is an insurance claim. He lost 200 acres to late seeding and subsequent frost damage in August. He was not alone. The county extension office estimated that the wet spring of 2008 cost Lac-Saint-Jean grain farmers somewhere between $11 million and $14 million in lost production, delayed seeding, and spoiled crops. The average operation running 500 conventional acres lost between $28,000 and $35,000 relative to a normal year. Frank Arsenault's no-till fields were not dry. This was not a story about water disappearing. The spring was wet everywhere. But the fields that had been under no-till management for 4 or more years had surface residue that slowed runoff and allowed water to infiltrate at a rate that his probe measurements had been predicting for 3 years. The organic matter that had been building in those fields at a rate of roughly 0.2 percentage points per year was holding moisture in a way that also counterintuitively reduced ponding by improving the soil's capacity to absorb and transmit water rather than simply holding it at the surface. More critically, the no-till fields had no tillage pan. The root channels and earthworm burrows that had been developing undisturbed for 4 years gave the water somewhere to go. Frank was in his fields by May 3rd. He had the east quarter seeded by May 8th and the home fields by May 15th. He was in the ground 3 weeks ahead of most of his neighbors. He did not sell a single bushel into the depressed early harvest market that caught the farmers who had gotten their crops in late. He seeded on schedule, grew a full-season crop, and harvested in September at normal prices. His canola came in at 34.2 bushels per acre on the no-till acres, against a county average that the Extension Office published in October at 24.8 bushels, reflecting the catastrophic impact of late seeding on yield potential. His revenue for 2008 finished $41,000 above his 2007 number. The county average grain farm finished $31,000 below its 2007 number. He did not go to the co-op and announce any of this. He did not write a letter to the Alma paper. He went to the county extension office in November and sat down with the agricultural specialist there, a woman named Colette Gervais, who had been watching the Arsenault operation with careful interest since 2005. And he went through his data with her, field by field, season by season, 4 years of red notebook records, and he answered her questions for nearly 3 hours. When he left her with photocopies of 4 years of yield tickets and the Laval Soil Lab reports, and a set of the research citations he had been working from since 2001. Colette Gervais published a summary of the Arsenault Farm's results in the Regional Extension Bulletin in February of 2009. It ran 4 pages. It included the yield comparisons, the soil organic matter trajectory, the wet spring performance data, and a description of the no-till system with a diagram of the cedar setup that looked quite a bit like the diagram Frank had first sketched in his red notebook in the spring of 2003. Let me tell you about the afternoon in March of 2009 when Régent Pelletier drove out to the Arsenault farm, because that afternoon is where something finally gets resolved. He came on a Wednesday in his co-op truck, arriving around 2 in the afternoon. Frank was in the machine shed, rebuilding a coulter assembly on the direct seeder, getting ready for spring. He heard the truck in the yard and came out to find Régent standing by the door of his vehicle, looking at the east quarter, which was covered in the flattened golden residue of last year's canola, lying undisturbed the way Frank's fields always looked in March. Régent was not the same man who had smiled behind the co-op counter in April of 2004. He was still recognizably Régent Pelletier. Same coat, same way of standing with his hands pushed into his pockets, but something in the set of his face had changed. He looked, Frank thought, like a man who has been preparing himself for a conversation he did not want to have, and has finally decided to have it anyway. "I read Colette's piece in the bulletin," he said. Frank waited. "The 2008 numbers," Régent said. "The seeding date comparison." "Those are from my elevator tickets," Frank said. Colette cross-referenced them with the county data. Régent nodded. He looked at the east quarter residue. He looked at it for a while. "I told you the clay needed to be worked," he said. "I told you you'd have disease pressure and compaction and poor emergence." He said it without the certainty it had carried in 2004. He said it like a man reading out a record he wishes were different. "You did," Frank said. "Doesn't look like that's what happened." "No," Frank said. "It isn't." A cold March wind came across the east quarter and moved the canola residue in a slow wave. Régent watched it for a moment. "I've got 7 farmers asking me about no-till since Colette's piece came out," he said. "They want to know how to set it up, what seeder to buy, how to manage the residue in a wet year." He paused. "I don't know how to answer them." Frank looked at him. "The thing to understand," Frank said, "is that the tillage pan I measured in the home field in 2004 didn't appear there because my father was careless. It appeared because every pass of the plow compacts the layer just below the working depth, season after season, and nobody measures it because it's not visible. You can't see what's happening 6 inches below the surface from the seat of a tractor." He paused. The wet spring didn't create a problem on those tilled fields. It revealed a problem that was already there. The tillage pan was always the limiting factor. The water just made it impossible to ignore. Régent looked at him. He nodded. Slowly, the way a man nods when he has run out of alternative interpretations. "Could you come in and talk to those 7 farmers?" he said. "At the co-op. I'll set up a meeting." "Yes," Frank said. "I can do that. Let me tell you about the years that followed that March afternoon, because the conversation in the Arsenault farmyard was not the end of this story. It was the beginning of something else. By the fall of 2009, Frank had spoken at 3 county extension meetings and 1 regional conference in Saguenay. The 7 farmers who had asked Régent about no-till after Colette's bulletin piece all converted at least a portion of their acres in the spring of 2009. By 2011, 24 farms in Lac-Saint-Jean County were running some form of reduced tillage or full no-till system. By 2013, the number was 39. Colette Gervais presented the county-wide data at the Quebec Agri-Food Conference in Quebec City in 2012. The session drew more registered attendees than any other breakout on the program. She cited Frank Arsenault as the source of the original on-farm work. He was in the audience. He was 59 years old. He had grease on his right hand from the hydraulic line he had been bleeding on the cedar that morning before driving down to the city. When Colette said his name, The people in his row turned to look at him, and someone near the front began to clap, and the room followed. Gerard Arsenault was in the audience, 3 seats to his right. When the room started clapping, Gerard stood up. He did not look at Frank. He looked at the front of the room, at the yield charts on Colette's slide, and he stood up straight, the way a man stands when he is proud of something he was wrong about and understands both things at once. Let me tell you about one more thing, because this story has a final turn in it, and it happens at the Arsenault kitchen table in the fall of 2014. Frank was 61. He had been running the full operation for 16 years by then, with Gerard in a diminished role that suited the older man better than he would have admitted in 2004. The farm was producing at levels that would have seemed implausible to anyone who had known it in 2003. All 720 acres under no-till management, fuel costs down 38% from the 2003 baseline in real terms, organic matter in the oldest no-till fields trending above 5%, which the Laval lab described in their report as exceptional for the soil series in question, and a reputation that had brought visitors from as far as New Brunswick and Manitoba to walk those fields and ask questions. At supper one evening in October, Frank's daughter, Sylviane, who was 26 and had spent 3 years working for an environmental consulting firm in Montreal before coming back to help with the operation, slid a stack of printed articles across the table toward her father. She had been reading about cover crops, not the single-species cover crops that some of the county's farmers had experimented with over the years, but complex multi-species mixes, radishes and hairy vetch and oats and phacelia, seeded after the grain harvest to keep living roots in the soil through the fall and into the early winter, building organic matter and biological activity and nitrogen fixation in the months when the ground would otherwise sit bare. She had a paper from Agriculture Canada and a farm report from a cover crop innovator in Prince Edward Island. She slid them across the table toward Frank. Frank looked at the papers. He looked at his daughter. And he thought about a kitchen table in March of 2004 and a red notebook, and a father who had said he needed to think about it and then kept his word and thought about it carefully before giving his son 160 acres and a chance. He looked at the articles for a long moment. Then he looked up at his daughter. "Yes," he said, "let's try it." He did not ask for 3 weeks to think it over. Gerard was at the table. He heard the exchange. He reached across and picked up one of Sylviane's papers and read the first page without saying anything. He set it back down. But Frank saw him later that evening take the red notebook down from the kitchen counter and carry it to the table and open it to a page near the back. Some things you learn the hard way, and some things you learn by watching someone you trust learn the hard way and being wise enough to recognize what you're seeing when it happens. Gerard Arsenault had learned it the slow way, over 2 seasons of watching his son's fields outperform everything he had built over 30 years of careful, adequate farming. He had learned it well enough that when his granddaughter slid a stack of articles across the same table, he did not say he needed to think about it. He reached for the notebook. The East Quarter in Lac-Saint-Jean County still runs under full no-till management. The home fields still run on the same system. The organic matter in the oldest fields is now above 5.3%, which the Extension Office calls outstanding for Grey Louvesoul soils in this part of Quebec. The tillage pan that sat at 9 inches in 2004 is gone. Frank Arsenault still carries a soil probe in his truck and still records the depth in a notebook. Not the original red one, which filled up in 2009, but a series that has continued from there, 1 per 2 seasons, kept in the same kitchen drawer where Gerard used to keep the yellow one. The 2 series of notebooks sit in that drawer together now. Different handwriting, different conclusions about what the same ground could do, arrived at by two men on the same farm a generation apart. Jean Pelletier retired in 2015 at the small gathering the co-op held for him at the Lions Hall in Alma. He gave a short speech in which he said that the thing he was most proud of, looking back on 30 years at the counter, was that he had been wrong about something important early enough in a man's career to watch that man be proven right. He did not say Frank Arsenault's name. He did not need to. The residue lay on those fields all winter and kept the soil alive underneath it. The direct seeder went in every spring, and the wheat came up through the stubble, and the canola followed it in rotation, and the roots went deeper every year. And the lesson that a 51-year-old farmer with a red notebook and a soil probe worked out on 160 acres in a wet spring in Lac-Saint-Jean County is still being taught, one undisturbed field at a time, on ground that finally got the rest it had always needed.